The time right now is 6 p.m., but we are waiting for few more people to join in. There are more people joining in. So we'll wait for few minutes, maybe approximately 5 minutes, and then we will begin the session. Until then, please hold on. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining. I hope you all are staying safe and staying indoors. So we still have a few more people that need to join, but we can get started and they'll, they'll tag along as we keep going. So again, thank you everyone for joining. I hope everyone's, staying indoors, staying safe. My name is Harsha Chituri, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Srinivasa Farms to today's webinar. The topic we're discussing today is how to overcome the impact of high soya price in feed formulation using alternative feed ingredients and formulation techniques. So the reason we chose this topic for today's webinar was given the current situation where the soya bean price has shot up and gone through the roof. It is important now more than ever for our farmers to figure out and educate themselves on alternative ingredient, because that will be the need of the hour. So keeping up with our best interest in supporting the farmers, we decided to host a webinar on feed formulations from the available alternatives worked by an expert global nutritionist. Now, let me introduce you to the global nutritionists that we have with us here today. It's my pleasure to introduce you guys to Vitor. Just a little bit about Vitor before I hand it over to him. So Vitor is a global nutritionist at Highline International. He provides nutritional services to Highline's customers worldwide and manages the nutrition of pedigree and grandparent breeding flocks in Iowa. Previously, Vitor was the technical services director at Highline Brazil. He was responsible for the management of all products and technical support for customers. Prior to joining Highline, Vitor worked on creating, implementing, and standardizing nutritional matrix for commercial laying flocks. Vitor holds an animal science degree, MBA in industrial poultry, and also holds an MBA in business management. So thank you, Vitor. Thank you for joining us today. Just before I hand it over, guys, one last thing. I know, as Vitor keeps presenting, you guys might have a lot of questions that come up. So please leave your questions in the chat box, and at the end of the session, we will make sure we answer all of them. Thank you, guys. Over to you, Vitor.
Thanks, Harsha. Thanks for the warm welcome. It's a real pleasure, guys, to be here with you. I'm really honored to be able to see this huge amount of people here and being able to say hi to all of you, even though virtually. But we hope that in the near future, we're gonna be over this mass COVID stuff and we will be able to be face to face again, and hopefully without masks, so we can continue to learn from each other. Okay. So as I said, and let me share my screen with you guys right now. Okay, so it's can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So yes, so it's a real important topic that we're gonna discuss today. And for this presentation, even though I am presenting the slides, but I had a great help from Srinivasa team and also from our Highline India team. So all of them later on the Q&A session, Dr. Krishna Reddy, Dr. Prasad, Dr. Jivan, and from Srinivasa, and from Highline side, Dr. Ramakrishna and Dr. Vinod, they will be helping me to take some questions, because I am very comfortable to reply the general nutrition and the genetics and everything involved in the international side. But for sure, on the local ingredients itself, they will have a much deeper knowledge than me. So they will be helping me answering some questions at the Q&A session. Okay. So for today's presentation, we're gonna be basically going through these 5 different topics. How the database uh, is being able to help us to have a very accurate and precision nutrition, and how this is fundamental for us to be able to reduce our costs. Actually, it's nearly impossible to reduce cost of production if you don't have a good database and a good amount of data from your farm. We're gonna see how energy can affect feed intake behavior, and we're gonna see in this topic that not always reducing energy gonna help us to save money in our activity. We're gonna go through protein reduction versus performance. It's probably one of the best ways to save money. It's to invest in a good amino acid nutrition. And then we're going to go to the alternative ingredients that it's the main topic of this presentation, mainly seeing the pros and cons of those ingredients. And at the last part, we're going to see some main additives and the cost reduction versus performance that we can get to using or not using these ingredients. Okay. So starting with the database, the first thing I have to say a huge thank you for all of you that are submitting data to our database. Srinivasa is doing a great job in collect all this data, and with this we are being able now to provide a very accurate nutritional requirement based on the local performance. So we don't need to use international standard. We have a very accurate and local standard for you guys. As we can see, we have a lot of data. We have more than 1100, almost 1200 entries in our database just from India. So again, a huge thank you both for you submitting the data, but also to Srinivasa that it's putting together all this data. So what we're gonna see here, it's a comparison between W80 in India and the global data. So the black line, it's the whole average of the Indian country, and this colored line here, and let me pick up my pointer here. So, and this colored line would be the average of the world. So basically this reddish line, it's above the global average. The white part here would be the global average. And this kind of bluish part, it's above the average, okay? And this is India. So the first point that we can see is egg weight. Egg weight is probably the whole or the main point that we have a breeding program in India. In India, it's the only country besides US that have a breeding program with Highline. So it's a really important country to us. And we can see here that the whole purpose is keep the egg weight lower than the standard or the international standard. And we are being able to do that. So uh, remember that egg weight drives a very important point of the even the energy, but especially of the amino acid requirements. So that's one of the reasons we have a different requirement for India. And then if we see the feed intake per bird per day, it's a little bit below the global average. And there's many reasons for that. We know that the Indian condition in terms of weather can be quite challenging than other areas. But for sure, we have a lot of data in our database from W80 in free range and cold areas that gonna drive this feed intake a little bit up. So it's quite interesting to see that the feed conversion it's very interesting here for you guys because you are able to have a good production with a lower feed intake. Now, when you see the mortality, That's a challenging part. We, unfortunately, you guys have to live with a lot of challenges, with a lot of diseases, and it's quite complicated to keep the mortality at lower levels, as in countries that are completely free of many diseases. So yeah, that's a very challenging point when we compare the Indian reality to the global reality for W80 production. And the production a little bit lower than the standard because of these topics that we said, challenge in terms of weather, in terms of a disease, sometimes even in terms of management. So we have a slightly lower production when we see the average of everyone. But we know that seeing the average for everyone, it's not always the best way to see the production. So what I did here, it was pick up all this Indian database, that's huge, and split into quartiles. So what we are seeing here is this production, the bottom 25%, and this is all ranked by hen-housed eggs. So we can see like the top flocks in hen-housed eggs, this would be their production. The 50 to 75% quartile, this would be their production. The 25 to 50% quartile, this would be their production. And the bottom quartile in terms of egg numbers, this would be their production. So we start to see a lot of difference, and we start to see that the best quartiles, they have some interesting aspects. They don't have almost any delay in production. And sorry, this is in weeks of production, not in age. It's a little bit a mistake from my part, but you can see that the first week of production, that would be 18, they already have some eggs. So this is a consequence of good uniformity and good body weight. So they have a very good production and a very good persistence. Now, when you see the body weight, for me, this is the most important topics. The flocks that have the major number of eggs, the top 25% quartile, we can see that they start production with a higher egg weight, almost 150 grams more than the flocks that has a lower performance. And we also can see that these top performing flocks, they achieve 1.4 kilos about 6 weeks before the flocks that are on the bottom quartile. So we can see here that the body weight during the growing phase has a huge impact on performance. And for sure, even though achieving the body weight during the growing phase, it's not a warranty that we're going to have an awesome production, but for sure not achieving these body weights, for sure it's a warrant that it's impossible to have a good production. So it's all about prevention. It's an investment. You guys need to achieve a good body weight if you want to have a good production and a good persistence of production. So again, best performing flocks, they always have a better body weight profile. Okay, we can even see here in this slide from Highline International, and this is from Highline Brown, not from W80, but the trend would be the same. The reason I have Highline Brown, it's because our most robust database, but we can see a clear trend in 60 weeks, hen-housed eggs, a positive trend with body weight at 18 weeks. So the heavier the flock begins the production, best gonna be our persistence of production and our egg numbers at 60 weeks. So it's very important topic. But now, the reason for me to split this data into quartiles is that now we are able to calculate the nutritional requirements of those birds based on the performance. And that's what we did on this slide. So we can see here, what I did was calculate this range of energy requirement based on the least performing flocks and the best performing flocks. So everyone should be around this gap here. And we can see that the best performing flocks, they are having a peak of energy requirement. And the peak of energy requirement is not always with the peak of production, but with the peak of egg mass. That doesn't happen at 25 weeks, but about 40 weeks. But we are basically seeing that it's almost 290 kilocalories per bird per day in thermal neutrality. Okay, guys, if the temperature is higher, we need to decrease this. If the temperature is lower, we need to increase this. But the very important fact here is that even for the upper standard or the lower standard, it's very persistent. So we can see that at 80 weeks, according to the calculations, we have about 6 kilocalories less. So if we want, the message here is, if you want to have a good persistence of production, we can't be messing with energy, at least not much. If we lose energy, we're gonna lose performance, and we're gonna see why. Uh, and this is a trend. That's why we can see that a lot of companies are already recommending to have isocaloric diets through all the production phase, and you just manipulate the amino acids, calcium and phosphorus. But energy should be as quiet as possible and as steady as possible. When we move now to lysine, almost the same story. We have a peak of requirement, uh, and I just removed this bump here, but this is a little bit missing data, but around 750 milligrams to the upper standard, about 710 milligrams for the lower performing flocks, and we also see a very steady requirement here. And for me, what it's very interesting to see, and that's the reason that I said thank you for the database at the beginning, is that if you see the amino acid requirement at 750 milligrams here, and if you see Highline W80 Indian version of the guide, you're gonna see that the guide, it's very, very or much close from the field reality. So our revised guide, it has the exactly 750 milligrams that we are calculating based on the current performance. So again, this is not an international guide. This is a local guide based on your performance. So we're going to have these requirements. We are going even a little bit lower than the calculations are, because we know that we have a huge challenge, that is to keep egg weight lower than 62 grams. So that's why the amino acids are a little bit lower. But the guide, it's very, very accurate to the condition. And we see here the international guide. Of course, if we suddenly move to a desire of higher egg weights, we still have some resources that we can explore in terms of amino acids. But we're gonna see that the local guide, we are using already this, let me hide these controls for me. We are having already this approach of constant energy, and the amino acids are very close to what they should be. Okay, so this is just to show how important it is to have this good amount of data that we can rely in doing the calculations. And of course, if we didn't have this, would be much more complicated to design nutritional requirements to attain your performance. Uh, Energy intake, it's one of the main topics when we talk about cost. We understand that energy, it's very expensive, and we even see that when we have some cost challenges, most of the times is one of the main ingredients that people are changing, try to save money. But the point is, whenever we reduce energy, the bird will more or less, but will always increase feed intake. So what we are seeing here, and this is from Steve Leeson, that birds actually, their feed intake is driven by three main points: gastric distension, blood glucose, and adipose tissue. And what we see as a summary of this, that chickens in general have a remarkable ability to control their energy intake when confronted with diets of varying energy concentration. That means we increase energy, feed intake will decrease. We decrease energy, feed intake will increase. Okay. Uh, and when you see this, what we could do here is collect a lot of data from different publications. You do like a meta-analysis here, and we can see this trend. As my energy increase from 2300 to 3100 kilocalories, of course my feed intake decreases. Okay, and the point here, it's what gets a little bit more complicated here, is that this relation is not 1 per 1. Almost never it's 1/1. That means if I reduce my energy in 2%, my feed intake will not increase in 2%. So the consequence of this invariable, when I start to decrease my energy, as this is the points that you are seeing here, they are here. As I decrease my energy, I will decrease my energy intake as well. So according to this data, I am reducing from 332 kilocalories per day to 285 kilocalories per day. So the birds are being able to increase a little bit their feed intake. As we can see, we are going from 100, low 100 to high 116, 119, but they are not being able to keep the energy intake. And of course, the consequence of that, if we are talking on the same temperature, that's the case here, of course, we are talking about losing production. So having this data, what we can do here, again, sorry, just the numbers. This data shows a 7% increase in feed intake to a 16% decrease in energy intake. So again, they are not being able to compensate this decrease in energy with increase in feed. Okay. So what we did here with this data now was to calculate a trend line with close to 50% accuracy, but showing what would be the expected feed intake change when we reduce the energy. And just a parenthesis here, what we are seeing now in both on the literature, but also in the field reality is that the chicken seems to be more effective in down regulate the feed intake when we increase the energy than up regulate the feed intake when we decrease energy. So it's gets a little bit more dangerous to reduce energy than to increase energy in terms of kilocalories intake per bird per day. So what we did here then is to calculate this, and we can see again that the energy reduction will increase the feed intake, but not in the same proportion to be able to keep the same energy intake per bird per day. And with this data, what I did was to calculate a diet or multiple diets with 4.2% calcium, zero point 0.4 available phosphorus, 0.8 digestible lysine, and about 16% crude protein. And this all with this different energy from 3050 to 2360 kilocalories per kilo. And we can see the prices here. So this change uh, saved me a lot of money. So it's plus $10, 756 rupees when I reduce from 3050 to 2360 kilocalories. That's more than 3% reduction in cost. And that's what I've seen a lot of farms doing. But if we go a little bit further on this analysis, we can see that this cost reduction, actually, when I divide my price per ton to my kilocalories per day, I see that gets more expensive per kilocalorie when I reduce my energy. So I spend $1.07 per kilocalorie when I'm feeding a 350 kilocalories diet, but I spend $1.12 when I'm feeding at 2360 kilocalories. That means that when I reduce my price in 3.1%, I'm increasing the kilocalories cost in 4.3% in this price condition. Of course, this will change from farm to farm, from country to country, from different amounts of or different profiles of feed price. Now, if I multiply my feed price by my feed intake and multiply this by 30 days, that would be the cost of one single laying hen during 1 month under these diets. So I can see that I would spend 99 cents of dollar to feed one bird for 30 days in a 50 kilocalorie diet, and I would spend $1.15 per bird per month to feed this bird at a 2360 kilocalorie diet. So it's a 16% increase in cost. If I multiply this by a 30,000 hen farm, that means that I have about $4,830 more, or 35 lakh Indian rupees extra per month to feed these birds from a 2360 kilocalories to a 35 kilocalories. Actually, the opposite. If I reduce the energy, I will have to spend more money to feed those birds in a lower energy than in a higher energy. So that means that that's the global reality. No, I'm just saying that not always reducing the energy is the best way to save money. In a lot of times, when we reduce energy, the birds will eat more. We're gonna have more feed cost. We're gonna have more freight. We're gonna have to buy more ingredients, more corn, more soybean meal. So the price reduction that we see is not always parallel to the production cost that we see. Okay, so that's something that we need to pay a lot of attention here. Now, for me, when we say about cost reduction, this is one of the main topics that we can work on. That is the protein reduction versus performance. Uh, we do know that reducing protein and adding synthetic amino acids is not something new. This is something that's published and worked since the 1980s, 1970s. Actually, we have a lot of publications already from the 60s, but we can see the not only in the field but also in some publications. This it's an interesting way to see. We have two informations from this slide. First, how the reduction of protein is not proportional to reduction in egg mass, and how lysine to protein ratio matters. So if we see these four set of diets here and their ideal protein profile here, and let's analyze from right to left, we see that we are basically only changing isoleucine and valine. We are keeping the same M plus C ratio, the same threonine, the same tryptophan, everything, just reducing um, isoleucine and valine. Of course, arginine doesn't make sense in a corn soybean meal diet. They always gonna be in excess. But what we are seeing here is that whenever we go reducing this, we are reducing also the protein. So we see here that I'm reducing my protein from 16 to 15 to 14 to 13, and that means a reduction of almost 20% in the protein, but my egg mass is reducing, yes, but in about 5%. So for me, the message here is sometimes we are looking for the maximum performance of the flock, and this costs some money. If we are really struggling with cost, we can sometimes reduce a little bit the amino acids, being aware that we're going to lose performance, but in the majority of time, this loss of performance is not proportional to the reduction in protein, okay? So differently from the amino acids that we saw, birds don't tend at least to compensate the reduction in amino acids in increasing the feed intake. They will basically start to lose a little bit of egg mass and performance, but that's some resource that would have here for us that would allow to save some money, lose some performance, but increase a little bit profitability in difficult times. So we can see that, yeah, we're gonna lose egg mass, but not in the same proportion of the reduction, okay? And if you do this in a really smart way, actually we don't lose egg mass at all. As we can see here, 6% reduction in the protein didn't change the egg mass because we didn't have a reduction in amino acids. And another point is that we're gonna see that the relation that we have here in protein to lysine actually affects the egg mass. So the lower is this relation, like in this case 4.5%, in this case 5.5%, it changes a lot the feed conversion in the egg mass. So if I go to a lower recommendation, what we are seeing here is that I need more protein to supply these amino acids, so I have a little bit higher egg mass, okay? Moving on, this another trial, it's showing for us sorry, the protein reduction with or without synthetic amino acids and the effect. So we can see that what they did in this trial from 1982, they reduced the protein from 15 and a half to 13, keeping the same lysine, but without adding any synthetic amino acid in this case. So we can see I had no synthetic amino acids here. I had no synthetic amino acids here. My protein went from 15.5 to 13%, and my egg mass went from 50 grams to 31 grams per bird. Now, when I did the same reduction in protein, but I did add all these amino acids, lysine, arginine, threonine, valine, tryptophan, methionine, and the isoleucine, I was able to keep the same egg mass even with this huge amount of protein reduction. So this is not new, guys. This is something that's proven, reproven. And for me, that's one of the main things that we should be looking right now. It's to have more synthetic amino acids in our diets. Unfortunately, I still see a lot of diets and a lot of visits that I go to the farm and they just have methionine. Sometimes they just have methionine and lysine, and we are trying to reduce costs. So my message here is, if you want to reduce costs, you need to invest in synthetic amino acids and lower your protein levels. You're gonna also have some good impacts in intestinal quality. We know that high protein diets can lead to some undigested ingredients inside the guts of the chicken, and this can lead to some problems as poor calcium absorption or a lot of intestinal quality problems. So again, for me, this would be one of the main research that we have in hands to reduce cost. It's to reduce protein. Okay, so I did some simulations here with my formulation uh, software, and basically this is, I made first one simulation of one diet using just methionine. This diet cost me $340 per metric ton. So we can see this. I have just corn, soybean meal, oil, limestone, DCP, salt, sodium bicarbonate, and methionine. And I have a few other additives that it's hidden here. It doesn't matter. It's going to be the same for all diets. But the first thing you can see here is, uh, let me hide this because it's really bothering me. Okay, so what we can see here is that we have a crude protein that I'm not defining minimal and maximal crude protein here. We are basically seeing this as a consequence of the amino acid balance. So if you see the way I'm formulating now, I'm just defining the digestible lysine and my ideal protein. So 90% M plus C, 21% tryptophan, all of this. So my protein here is just a consequence of this amino acid balance. And I just have methionine as synthetic amino acid. If we move on to the next step, we're gonna see that what is limiting our performance, it's basically M plus C and threonine. So I'm asking for a minimum of 90, I'm having 90%. I'm asking for a minimum of 67, I'm having 67, but I'm overfeeding all other amino acids enable to feed these limiting amino acids. So what is telling me that if I had these two amino acids in a synthetic way, I could feed less of these amino acids. And that's what I mean in terms of excess of non-digested nutrients. Enable to feed those birds just with methionine, I'm overfeeding a lot of tryptophan, I'm overfeeding a huge amount of isoleucine, and I'm overfeeding a huge amount of valine, a lot of it. So this will be all undigested nutrients that gonna lead to enteritis, that gonna lead to heat stress, and for sure that gonna lead to expensive nutrients that the birds are not utilizing. But more than that, it's expending energy to eliminate those ingredients. So it's not a smart way to formulate a diet. Now, what I did here is to add lysine and threonine to these diets. And at least in my reality, this is the three amino acids that are more economic feasible to feed those birds. Uh, and we will see that it will change from country to country, from area to area. I have some other countries that I can use easily 5 amino acids. I have some countries that I can use 7 amino acids. So it's going to change from country to country. But what we see here is that now I have the same corn and soybean meal, the same oil, limestone, my DCP, but now I have methionine, I have lysine, and I have threonine. Just with this change, my protein that was more than 18% is reduced now to 17%. I still have my 0.9. I still have the same calcium and phosphorus. I still have the same energy. But with this, I reduced it in more than $9 or 720 rupees per metric ton. And I reduced 66 kilos of soybean meal per metric ton, just adding these two amino acids. Because now, as we can see, these limiting amino acids, I'm feeding them with synthetic. So now I don't need to supply excess of tryptophan to supply threonine because the threonine is here. I don't need to supply a very good, a very high excess of isoleucine. So you see now that my next limiting amino acid would be isoleucine, but it's right on the spot because I don't need to supply threonine to protein. I'm supplying threonine to synthetic amino acids. Okay, so guys, we need to use synthetic amino acids. But this is the economic way. This is how we do to reduce the cost, but we still can go a little bit further on. We know that we have a lot of synthetic amino acids, but not all of them are feasible to be used in terms of cost. But we know that sometimes we have an emergency, like what we are seeing right now. Soybean prices are very high, but more than that, sometimes even that we are willing to pay this high price is not fully available. So what I did here was a simulation to increase our cost, but being able to save as much soybean meal as I can. So now in this formula, what I did is formulate with methionine, lysine, threonine, tryptophan, isoleucine, and valine, as we can see here. So you can see the costs of my ingredients, and you can see that at least here in US, isoleucine, it's very expensive. So it doesn't pay off. So that's why my cost increased from 339 on the original diet, decreased to 230 just with 3 amino acids. Now it's back increases to $343. But with this diet, I could save 136 kilograms of soybean meal per metric ton. So it's a very or a much lower protein. As you can see here, we dropped from 18% to less than 16%. Of course, it's more expensive, but it's just to show that we still have some resources, even though that we have to invest more money, but to in a specific time frame, we can reduce a lot of soybean meal purchase just to go to our emergency period. Okay, so this is another way to use synthetic amino acids to reduce some specific protein ingredient, even though that we have to pay a little bit more for the tonnage of the feed. Okay. Now, moving on to the alternative ingredients, and that's the point that Srinivasa and Highline India helped me a lot because you guys know these ingredients much more than me. But what I did here, it's get this list of the most common alternative ingredients. And what I did was to compare the energy cost with corn and the amino acid cost of these ingredients with soybean meal. So what I have here is the price of these ingredients, in this case, cotton meal, the hyper, the 39%, actually the ones that you had is 40%. I compared with the corn at this price, 17,000 rupees, and soybean meal price at 70,000 rupees. And we can see that basically the cotton is very helpful to help us to supply amino acids because it's costs, like, let's pick up a specific one here, like isoleucine. It's 40% cheaper to supply isoleucine through cotton than through soybean, rather through soybean meal, but it's much worse in terms of energy. So what this is telling me, I can save some soybean meal, feeding some cotton, but for sure I'm gonna need to increase oil or any other energy source to help me keep the energy from my diet. What we also see here is that the digestibility of cotton is not so good. When we go to corn and soybean meal, corn would be having more than 86, 87% digestibility, the coefficient of digestibility, and the soybean meal from 88 to 94%. So we can see that it's quite crucial whenever you are doing this shift from conventional to alternative ingredients, that you consider the different digestibility from these ingredients, that the majority of the time will be lower than conventional ingredients. We also see that the whereas the phytate amount of this ingredient, it's quite high, or average to high. For just to have a comparison, corn, it's about, or maize, it's about 0.18 of phytate. So this is a lot. So we have a lot of potential of phosphorus released through phytates when we are using cotton. And this is the recommended inclusion according to Rostanho. 5% the practical inclusion and 8% the maximum inclusion, but we're going to see other sources during the presentation. But one of the things we have to be careful is the gossipol. If we feed much higher than this 5 to 8%, we have a huge risk to have pink, uh, either albumin but egg yolks because of the gossipol. So it's something that we need to be paying attention. And excess of gossipol can also lead to liver damage in the long term. So it's something that we need to be aware when we are using cotton. Okay. Moving on to rice DDGS. Here we are seeing a rice DDGS with 45% protein. And we see the same situation, even though it's not the best ingredient to supply lysine. We can see that soybean meal, it's still much better to supply lysine, but through all other amino acids, it's more effective to supply these amino acids through rice DDGS than through soybean meal. But again, it's much worse of to energy. So the same situation. If I'm replacing soybean meal by rice DDGS, I'm gonna have a better profile of amino acids, but I'm gonna be short in energy. So probably I will need more corn or more oil or more enzymes or whatever. The digestibility, Rostanho doesn't have the rice DDGS, so I just used rice bran as a reference, but the same situation, a little bit lower than 70%. So we need to adapt our digestibility and our ingredients here, okay? And in terms of phytate, a lot of phytate here, so we can again have a very good phytase efficiency when using rice DDGS. And this is the recommended inclusion uh, based on Rostanho, but we're gonna see, as I said, other more local recommendations that I would be more comfortable with. Okay. Now, sunflower, it's a very common one. I like sunflower a lot because not only has a good profile of amino acids, kind of fiber. It has a huge amount of fiber, but the majority it's insoluble fiber. We know that insoluble fiber help us a lot to provide fiber without generating heat increment, so metabolic heat. So it's a very interesting ingredient when comparing the cost with sunflower with the cost of corn and soybean meal, we see the same situation that we saw with the other ingredients, more effective to supply amino acid, less effective to supply energy. So again, we're gonna save some money in soybean meal, but we needed to have an alternative energy source when using sunflower. We have some anti-nutritional factors, but especially one of the main problems is the dark color that can lead to black tongue syndrome. Chickens that are eating sunflower generally will have this black tongue. Some people sometimes may confuse this with mycotoxins, but it's just a side effect of using sunflower. You just need to pay attention to that. And would be the practical and maximum inclusion according to Rostanho. It can change from country to country as well. De-oiled rice bran, this is an ingredient that I like a lot because not only can supply amino acids in a good manner, but also the energy content, it's much closer from the corn. So this is a kind of ingredient that when I'm using to replace protein source, I won't need as much oil or as much other ingredients when compared into sunflower or to other ingredients. So this is an interesting ingredient that we can consider when we are trying to save some cost. The digestibility is not as great as corn, but if we are formulating, of course, with digestible amino acids, we would be considering the digestibility, and this would be the recommended inclusion amount. In terms of phytase, It's a lot of phytate here, so we could expect a lot of phosphorus release. We just need to double check always the amount of soluble and insoluble phytates that we can find here. But it's a very interesting ingredient to be used. We just need to consider some anti-nutritional factors, but especially the variabilities. This ingredient sometimes from one batch to the other batch, you have a lot of a change in protein content, in fiber content. So that's something it's a challenge sometimes to try to standardize nutritional matrix for ingredients that's changing from batch to batch, but it's a very good ingredient. Next ingredient that I have here on my list would be the maize gluten 60%. This ingredient, it's very nice. I like a lot for the technical side of this ingredient. We can see that digestibility coefficient, it's very good. Some amino acids is even better than soybean meal and corn in terms of amino acid digestibility. But unfortunately, this ingredient, it's not cheap. So we can see that we have like a mixed response here. Some amino acids are more expensive to provide. Some amino acids are cheaper to provide when we compare to soybean meal. Energy is much higher because it's a concentrated protein. So of course the energy amount is not so good per inclusion. But we still have a few other challenges. The phytate value is average, but for sure one of the main points here is mycotoxin. We know that mycotoxin is being a global challenge again, especially since late January, beginning of February. And we know that this ingredient tends to concentrate 3 to 4 times more the mycotoxin when compared to the original maize that generated this ingredient. So that's something that we need to be aware. It's a very stable, it's a very digestible ingredient, but for sure we can expect a lot of mycotoxin as well. Okay, so it's something that we need to pay attention. We have for sure much more ingredients or many more ingredients than that. I concentrated on this one for sake of time, but during the Q&A, we can see a little bit more in detail some other ingredients. One thing that I thought that was relevant, it is the inclusion of these ingredients. So what I like to do when we see this recommendation of maximum and minimal or maximum and practical inclusion, we should not, in my opinion, keep to this maximum when we are using multiple ingredients. So what I like to do is, if I'm using just one alternative ingredient, I'm considering 100% of the recommended inclusion. If I'm doing 2 ingredients, I'm keeping to 60%. If I'm doing 3 ingredients, 50% of each, and that goes on. So that would be, for example, just a simulation. If I had doing a formula just with cotton and the maximum recommended inclusion is 8%, I'm using 8%. If I'm doing 2 ingredients, what I'm doing is considering 60% of each. So I'm using 4.8% of cotton, and from the 12% maximum inclusion, I'm using just 7.2%. This is leading to a 12% inclusion of alternative ingredients, but not the maximum of each. And that goes on until I go like 4 or more amino acids. I'm using just 35% of the recommended maximum inclusion of each. So even that I can have these maximum inclusions, I'm adding 22% of alternative ingredients, considering 35% of the maximum recommended inclusion of each one. Okay, otherwise we're gonna have a lot of poor digestible ingredients in our diets, and this can start to affect performance and especially can generate some challenges in terms of intestinal health. Okay, uh, other very important point when we are using these ingredients, and we said about the fiber profile, is the NSP content of this feed stuff. So we have some tables, and these tables were published in the Rostanho tables 2017. This feed was generated by AB Vista, and they did a very good job. It's an impressive job in determining the main NSP content of the feed stuff. The A lot of them. So we go we have basically, I guess, 3 or 4 pages of this profile. I won't go because for the sake of time, but we can see the main ingredients here, the grains, the protein sources, the variations like rice here. So we can have the full NSP profile of these ingredients here. And how this help us? Of course, I imagine the majority of us are using some kind of enzyme here. But what we can see that when we compare a conventional diet, that when I say conventional is basically corn, soybean meal, or maize soybean meal, to an alternative diet that would be less maize and soybean meal, a little bit more of alternative ingredients as here, we're going to have a much different NSP profile. So here I made a simulation, a diet with 62% maize, 23% soybean meal, about 2.5% soybean hulls, and none of these ingredients. 12.4% of the other ingredients as limestone, as DCP or MCP, salt, stuff like that. And this is the NSP profile that I get from this diet. Now, if we move to an alternative diet, reducing maize, reducing soybean meal, adding millet, adding sorghum, uh, gluten, peanut meal, the oiled rice bran, broken rice, wheat bran, all of this sunflower meal. Now I still have the 12.14% of other ingredients, but you can see how I change completely my NSP profile. So in this case, what would be the practical approach? If I'm moving to a from a conventional diet to an alternative diet, I would be increasing the NSPs that can digest xylanase that contain xylanase and glucanase, because there would be more xylose and glucose on these diets. But I couldn't use much more beta mannose and alpha galactosidase because these keep the same. But for sure, I would change the profile of my NSP enzymes when I'm moving from a conventional to alternative diets with more xylanase and more glucanase. Okay, to being able to digest these ingredients, especially xylanase. So that would be a smart approach when formulating diets. And I see a lot of farms that are doing already this. They have all the NSP profiles in their diets. They don't have the commercial blend of the enzyme anymore, but they have the individual NSP enzymes, and they will shift to different profiles of enzyme according to the NSP profile of each diet. Okay. Now here it's a very interesting publication from Poultry Nutrition Bites that Dr. Jivan sent me a few days ago. Uh, it's a very recent one. It's an Indian one that has a lot of uh, interesting data that we can see with all the anti-nutritional factors. So this is very handy whenever we are adding these ingredients. We should be paying attention on the anti-nutritional factors. One that I would like to make some emphasis is the rapeseed meal or the mustard that has a lot of anti-nutritional factors. But we have to pay attention especially to the uric acid and glucosinolates because they have some interesting aspects in terms of uric acid. If we go for more than 10 or 12 milligrams of uric acid per kilogram of body weight, we can have some serious problems of liver toxicity. We can have some fat accumulation around the heart that is called myocardial lipodosis, uh, fat around the heart, and basically this can generate to the growth disruption. Same thing with glucosinates, has a lot of anti-nutritional factors that can generate a lot of disruption in the amino acid absorption. So if we go with high doses of these ingredients, we need to be aware that we are in the risk of permanent and temporary problems. Okay, this this fat around the heart, it's not so difficult to overcome, but when we go to the liver toxicity and the growth disruption, for sure, it's something that's going to have permanent effects in our flocks. Okay, so we have the all other ingredients here, but it's a very interesting publication. This is still from the same publication, showing their recommendation in terms of different alternative ingredients here. So it's much more complete than what I showed there. So you guys can also have a base uh, based on this table. This is from Steve Leeson, from a presentation that also I got from Dr. Jivan, really interesting one, where we can see uh, his analysis of potential issues when we feed those ingredients. So we have a little bit different ingredients here as well. All the issues in terms of mycotoxin, the consistency between batch to batch, fat rancidity, especially when we see these ingredients under heat stress or during the summer months, that as we are right now moving in India to these very extremely hot days, especially meat and bone meal. That's something that it's really should be avoided during this period. But anyway, this is another reference of uh, anti-nutritional factors and potential issues with alternative ingredients. Okay, so moving on, this is something that it's very important for us to understand, and that was something that Dr. Prasad was telling me, that he's facing this in the field. Dr. Prasad, it's always facing the field, and he's seeing a lot of these issues that we are reporting here. But basically, just some concept here. Birds don't need protein. They eat protein to transform this protein through amino acids, and the amino acids will be partially digested. So uh, we need to aim to feed digestible amino acids. These digestible amino acids will partially digested from the total, and this will be extracted from protein. So the theory here is that we have an ideal ratio between every single amino acid and lysine, and these different ratios that we are seeing here, publications from the 80s, from the 1980s, or from the 1990s, up to a little bit recent publications from amino acid companies, and even ours, that you see that's going changing from time to time. But basically, this is the recommendation that we have an ideal ratio between amino acids. Why I'm saying that? The reason is because, according to what Dr. Prasad reported me, some companies, I don't know if it's by purpose or by lack of knowledge, are reformulating diets just with total protein and total amino acids without considering the amino acid profile or the ideal protein. So I did a simulation here. Uh, this is a conventional diet, an alternative diet. The conventional diet, basically, this is the composition: corn, soybean meal, no alternative ingredients, just a little bit of corn gluten meal, DCP, limestone, sodium, sodium bicarbonate, methionine, lysine, and threonine, some other additives and some other nutrients that or ingredients that I hid here. And this is the alternative ingredients. Now, less soybean meal, we have some peanuts, some corn gluten, we have some broken rice, all of this. So when we see just the cost reduction between those diets, we see that it's $23 reduction, 1,700 rupees reduction. That's huge amount of money. Now, let's see the nutritional profile of those diets. We can see that the conventional diet versus the alternative diet, I have almost the same amount of protein, 17.9 to 17.87. I have a very close amount of linoleic acid. I have a very close amount of crude fiber, exactly the same calcium, 4%, exactly the same available phosphorus, 0.5%, exactly the same energy, 2870, just 1% difference in total lysine and total methionine. So based only on this information, I could be mistakenly led that those diets are similar, even that they cost $23 or 1,700 rupees different. But if I move further on in the nutrient profile, I can see that these diets have much less digestible M plus C, especially because in this formula, I didn't block the cysteine, just the methionine. So I could drop the M plus C from 90% to less than 60%. Threonine, I could reduce from 0.12 to 0.18. Tryptophan, I made a huge reduction here in terms of, oh, this is threonine, sorry, this is tryptophan. Threonine, I made a huge reduction from 0.7 to 0.53. Isoleucine and valine, I did a huge reduction, but all of these I can hide and I still can have the same amount of total amino acids and protein. So the message here, guys, if you have diets with the same amount of protein and the same amount of total amino acids, especially just lysine and methionine, that it's not insurance, that's not a guarantee that you're going to have the same performance, because the digestible amino acids can be vastly different. And in this case, if I'm feeding those two diets here, for sure I will be losing production, I will be losing egg weight, I will be losing body weight, and this both can have some permanent damages into the flock. They cannot recover unless I molt those flocks. So be really careful with what the kind of proposal we were receiving, because as we can see, we can mask a much cheaper diet into the same protein profile and the same total amino acids profile. Okay, so this probably, if I would say that just one message from this presentation you take home, would be this one: pay attention in the digestible amino acids, not only the protein content and the amino acid content or the total amino acid content of these diets. Okay, so let's move on. uh, Additives versus performance. Probably this is one of the most controversy topics, because we have a lot of additives, we have a lot of promises from the companies that are selling these additives. I will put here not the ones that I think that's are best or worth, but the ones that I'm facing more frequent in my visits. So probably there's some ingredients that are not listed here. It's not mean that I don't believe or don't trust or recommend or do not recommend. Is basically in terms of relevance in my visits. But what I see most of the offers are in basis of NSP diets, protease or multiprotease sometimes, phytase, and phytase for sure is one of the most proven ingredients. I would say more than 70% of the world use any kind of or some kind of phytase. The problem is these super phytase or super doses of phytase. We are seeing some problems with that, but I don't think it's the case for the presentation right now. We are seeing multi-enzymatic blends that will have one or two kinds of NSP, protease or multiprotease, phytase, all in one single product. And this can be very convenient from the customer point of view, not so practical when we are changing constantly our ingredients, because we see that the NSP profiles changes from diet. So convenient and not convenient depends on how you see. Fat emulsifier, it's something that it's becoming more and more popular, and a lot of the digestibility enhancers as probiotics, prebiotics, symbiotics, postbiotics, organic acids, herbal extracts, phytogenics, all of them can help a lot to improve the digestibility. But again, uh, nothing will be more effective than a good formulation and lower protein levels with synthetic amino acids. It's one of the most helpful things we can do in terms of digestibility enhancement, because of the least amount of non-digest ingredients. Okay, so we wouldn't have time to go through all the details in all these ingredients. So I choose one that is NSP enzyme, probably because that's the ingredient or that's the additive that has the major potential to reduce costs depending on how we use it, how rational or how uh, fantasy way we use this. You can have some good and some bad effects. So I choose an SP, and I did some simulations here but we can discuss all these other additives during the Q&A. So what I did here was NSP enzyme with different superdose scenarios. I choose this random enzyme, doesn't matter the name or the composition, but basically it costs, the offer that I had from this product was $12 per kilo, or 885 rupees per kilo. The supplier provided me this information. My NSP can save you 60 kilocalories with 0.01% inclusion, or 100 kilocalories with 200 grams per ton inclusion. So with this information, I went to look a little bit better to the dose response research that they had, and I could find some interesting data both on broilers and laying hens. So this was the broiler dose response. So even though they are recommending zero point 0.1 to 0.02, they have dose response up to 500 grams for broilers and up to 700 grams, I guess it was from laying hens. And we can see that even they are showing the linear trend line, but if you apply the quadratic trend line, we see that the dose response is not linear as that. We have a better response on the beginning, and probably a little bit lower response at the end. Of course, the reason for this is the more enzyme I add into the same diet, percentually, I will have less NSP per unit of enzyme, because I have more enzyme by unit of grains. So of course, the dose response of enzyme can never be linear. I can have double the dose of enzyme and double the energy liberation or the amino acid liberation or whatever I'm using use this enzyme. And this is what exactly what we saw in the laying hens dose response. So uh, the result here was that with 100 grams per ton, or 0.01%, the energy release was 60 kilocalories. Now, when I double the dose, of course, I didn't double the energy response. I was just increasing a certain amount to 100 kilocalories. Now I have 3 times the initial dose, and for sure I don't have 3 times the dose response. So this was what happened. I go increasing my dose response, and up to a certain point, I will practically won't have any gain anymore. So I see that moving from 500 grams to 600 grams of this enzyme was just changing 2 kilocalories. From 400 grams to 500 grams, just 5 kilocalories. So you can see that, of course, the initial gains are very good, but we tend to flat out as we improve or as we increase the amino acid or the enzyme inclusion in the diet. Okay, and this is the lysine response. A little bit different. We know that the main purpose of NSP, it's not to release amino acids that would be on the protease, but we also have some effect, but the shape of the curve, it's kind of similar. Now, having this, what we could do is back engineer the nutritional matrix, and I consider here using the lysine and the energy. I back calculate all the amino acids. So this would be the nutritional matrix that I calculated based on zero point 0.1 to 0.6 kilos, or 100 grams to 600 grams per ton. And it's quite interesting to see that, again, this will not be linear. As I increase in 6 times my inclusion, of course, I do not increase in 6 times my response. Okay, this is, for me, this is a very critical message. So now let's see this in a little bit different way. If we see this graph again, the first thing that we're gonna see, and the key message here on enzymes, it's not a linear response. As I increase in 100% the inclusion, I just increase in 67% the energy release. When I increase in 200%, that means 3 times, I can just increase in 125 the energy release, and this goes on. With 500% the inclusion rate, I will just have 170% the energy release. So when you do this backwards, that means that the kilocalorie cost will be much lower on the lower dose and much higher on the higher dose, because of course the enzyme will be less and less efficient per unit of enzyme when comparing the lower dose. So what I see here is the potential to sell this enzyme would be much different in different realities. The question that I always do is, what is more important in the moment? Have a low kilocalorie contribution from this enzyme at a cheap investment price, or have a high release of kilocalorie at the expense of a high investment price? So this will change, and there is no unique answers. This customer or this supplier was recommending me 100 to 200 grams. Why? Because it's the most cost effective area to supply this NSP. So this is the in terms of enzyme, or in terms of kilocalorie costs, that would be the most effective way to save money. But when we go to the scenario that we are living right now, probably not the same situation. So I simulate three scenarios here. First scenario, this enzyme again, it cost me $12 per kilo, and I had this diet, 2,700 kilocalories. And this diet, at the moment, I had no enzymes. So this diet have basically 62% of maize, 22.5% of soybean meal, 1% of oil, uh, and of course we're gonna have about 12 to 14% of all other ingredients. That doesn't matter, would be the same. So the cost of maize, soybean meal, and oil, it's adding me $248.89. So that will be the cost per ton of this diet. If I divide the cost per ton by the amount of energy that I have, it costs me 9 cents for kilocalorie when I'm feeding this diet without enzymes. Okay, so again, this is the cost, this is the amount of kilocalories. I'm just dividing and seeing what's the investment in terms of US dollars per kilocalorie without using the enzyme. Now, let's add the enzyme at the same dose response trial that we saw on their paper, from 100 grams to 600 grams per ton. US dollars per kilocalorie on the enzyme, as we saw on the previous graphs, right here, right? From 0.2, from 0.04, it's what we are seeing here. So we have also different enzymes contribution, as we saw, from 60 kilocalories to 162 kilocalories. Now, this is the new formula in terms of kilocalories. If I'm reducing from 2700, if I'm apporting 60 kilocalories, I'm doing a formula with 20-60-40, and this go phase by phase. If I'm reducing 100 kilocalories from 2700, I'm now formulating a diet with 2600 kilocalories, and this goes further on until 2538 kilocalories. And these would be the costs in US dollars from this diet with different inclusions of enzyme, from 243 to 233, from an original cost of 248. Okay, of course, I'm doing this with enzymes, so I have, of course, to consider the enzyme inclusion. Now, 100 grams of this enzyme that costs $12, of course, cost $1.12 per ton of diet, and 200 grams cost me $2.4 because of $12 multiplied by 200 grams, and this goes on until the maximum dose here that I did, 600 grams, that cost me $7 per inclusion. Okay, now if we compare the final cost, $243 plus $1.20 of the enzyme, this enzyme cost me, or this diet cost me $244.55 with the virtual 2700 kilocalories, considering 60 kilocalories from the enzyme. So I have a reduction of 1.74% because my original diet was 248. With the 200 grams, same scenario. Now I have $239 plus $2.40 from 200 grams of the enzyme. This diet cost me 242 against 248 original diet. This is a 2% cost reduction. And I did this every single scenario. And in this specific scenario, where I saving more money, it's at 400 grams per ton. because this I have a 3.8 reduction, even that I have less efficiency of the enzyme, and even that I'm paying 4 times more enzymatic inclusion. But this is because of the maize price and the soybean meal price that I simulated here. So even though it's not the most efficient way in terms of enzyme activity, is the most efficient way to save money in this reality. Now let's move to the same mathematics here, but with cheaper ingredients and very cheap. And this is how hypothetical scenarios, okay? So the same diet, the same enzyme, but now I have a maize, a very cheap maize, $75 per kilo or per metric ton. I have $100 of soybean meal. This leads me to a $74 diet. That's very unrealistic, but just for the sake of the simulation, okay? So all the same mathematics. In this simulation, we can see that the best efficiency of the enzyme happens at 100 grams. And actually, with 600 grams or after 400 grams, these diets are becoming more expensive with enzyme than without enzyme. So when I have cheap ingredients, for sure, the lower inclusion of this NSP enzyme would be the best and the most effective way for me to use this enzyme. Now let's move to the completely opposite scenario. Very expensive ingredients. So I have still the same diet, I have still the same enzyme, but now I have a 7 times more expensive maize and a 8 times more expensive soybean meal, and the oil is 3 times more expensive. So now I have a $762 per ton diet without the enzyme. And as we can see here, in this case scenario, the scenario that I'm saving more money, it's with 500 grams per ton, that I'm saving 5%. I'm reducing from 762 without enzyme to 723, even though that the cost per kilocalorie of 500 grams release is much lower than the cost of 100 grams release. But this is just to show you guys that there is nothing like a universal or unique way to use an additive. And even the same additive can change the way we use from scenario to scenario. If you have a pressure for more performance, if you have a pressure for more uh, feed cost savings, it can change from time to time. And if you have a moment of the year where the ingredients are cheaper or more expensive, we should be always reevaluating these ingredients on how to use, because for sure the response is going to be very variable. As we can see here, the same additive, it can be used with 1/5 or 5 times more the inclusion from one period of the year to another period, depending on the cost of the ingredients. Okay, so all right, I'm talking for 1 hour and 13 minutes now, so I guess that's enough. What we thought today is that the database, it's going to be crucial for us to reduce our costs. Without trustable key performance indicators, it will be impossible to plan for a real reduction in production costs. If you don't understand how your birds will react in terms of feed intake to reduction or to increase in energy levels, you can't reduce your costs, or you're just going to be guessing what's happening. Energy versus feed intake behavior, we've seen that decrease in energy will always lead to increase in feed intake, more or less amount, but always. And it may be profitable or not profitable in different ingredient costs. So sometimes reduce energy, you reduce costs. Sometimes reducing energy, you increase your costs. We've seen that protein reduction is the most proven and feasible way to help with intestinal quality, and this will help you to save a lot of money, and birds will not react to increasing feed intake. Someone is doing some red lines here. Okay, so we will not have the feed intake increase when we reduce protein the same way we're going to have it energy. Alternative ingredients, all of them it's very variable. We can have a lot of difference between batches from these ingredients. We have a lot of anti-nutritional factors that we need to consider, some then more or less detrimental to production, some of them with temporary effects, some of them with definitive effects that can damage your production for the remaining life of the flock. Different inclusions, we have to consider that if I'm using one ingredient or multiple ingredients, the maximum inclusion gonna change. And again, the variation between batches, it's one of the most challenging things because it's quite critical for us to have a accurate and a representative matrix. And this is difficult when we have variation between batches. In our additives versus cost reduction versus performance, we did just one example here in NSP, but we saw that the super dose of the enzymes can change from time to time according to the ingredient costs variation that we are seeing. So there is not like a universal way or a only way to use an additive. You need to do your analysis, and maybe what it's working in your neighbor doesn't work in your farm because you have different realities. So do not take the supplier recommendation to like written on stone. You need to do your own analysis and evaluate how this product would work in your farm. Okay, so that's what I had to say. Sorry to extend the extra 15 minutes from what we were planning, but we're gonna be open now for Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, we will have
I guess
Dr.
you're on
Jeevan.
mute. Sahi.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sahi, I guess you're on
Yes.
mute.
Can you hear me now? Just yeah. Um, just a minute.
Okay, now I can hear you.
Yes. So we will have Dr. Jeevan and Dr. Prasad read out the questions to you, Vitor. We
Okay.
have. Yeah. Just give us just 30 seconds. Yeah, Dr. Jeevan, are you there?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Should I start taking the question one by one?
Yeah, Dr. Jeevan, can you go ahead?
Sure.
Yes.
Vitor, first question is, does isoleucine lysine ratio put negative effect on bird performance if increased from the standard limit? Vitor, you are able to hear me?
Now I am, yes.
The first question is, does digestible isoleucine lysine ratio put a negative effect on the bird performance if increased from standard limit?
Yes. So the ratio that we are recommending for isoleucine, it's changing from 80 to 82, 83%, depending on the phase. Isoleucine can have some support activity, both to lysine and from some sulfurated amino acids. So we see two main effects. One, it's the internal egg quality. and also a little bit of the absorption of the water soluble vitamins, or especially the complex B. They can be some amino acid dependent, and they can be some isoleucine dependent. So it can have some direct impact in internal quality, in egg production, and also some indirect impact, because it can um, limit a little bit the vitamins absorption if not in the proper amount.
Next question is, uh, what about the gossypal toxicity in case of cotton seed meal?
Yeah, cotton, it's good ingredient in terms of the crude protein amount, high, very high crude protein. It has, as we said, some cheap amino acid supply, but it had a gossypol that can generate this pink yolk, pink egg, and for sure intestinal quality, you can have some disruption in intestinal quality, and this can lead especially to a lack in mineral absorption. So one of the claims is that if you have a high dosage for a longer time, you can eventually see uh, some bad eggshell quality because of a lower, especially limestone absorption.
Uh, I'm Dr. Prasad Peterson. One question. If we use phytase, protease, and NSP enzymes all three together at the prescribed dosage, should we use the energy release matrix of all the three enzymes, or should we consider the energy released by NSP enzymes only?
Yes, Dr. Prasad, that's the way I like to do. If I'm using multiple enzymes, I'm considering the stronger point of each enzyme and not from all of them. So if I'm using NSP, protease, and phytase, I'm considering just the calcium and phosphorus from the phytase. I'm considering only the energy in the NSP, and I'm considering just the protein and amino acids from the protease and nothing else. So I just keep the enzymes to their uh, recommended nutrient or the recommended points.
With the next question is about what is the best option to reduce the cost? Either reducing the crude protein with the corn soya diet, or replacing the soya with the unconventional feed like DDGS and MGM.
Probably both together, right? That would be the most feasible way. If you reduce if you are not using constantly synthetic amino acids, you can see some cost reduction already when you reduce the protein and add synthetic amino acids, especially lysine and threonine. Those are easy. Threonine is cheap, lysine is cheap, even cheaper than methionine. So it's a no-brainer. You should use. But when you are already at this point, then you cannot like increase, or as we saw, we can add some other amino acids that can decrease your protein inclusions, but can probably also lead to increase in feed price. So at this point is the moment where we start to add alternative ingredients if we are able to consider and to keep to the digestible amino acids and the ideal protein ratios. So I would say first one, and second, alternative ingredients.
Another question, Vitor sir. How to manage high feed intake in summer months with low protein diets? In our presentation, you have shown the 13% CP. Arginine to lysine ratio was less than 100. That is about 92 in the presentation. Will it show any impact on performance?
Absolutely. Uh, if you have lower protein as 13 without the proper amino acids, especially in summer months, we're gonna be seeing a much lower amino acid intake, specifically milligrams per bird per day, and this will we're gonna lack a lot of performance. The and that's the crucial point here. Birds will react to energy, but they also gonna react to the temperature. So especially in summer months, if we reduce the energy content, The bird should eat more to compensate, but we have the environmental stress, they have the heat stress, we have the water intake that they will not be able to drink as much water as they need, so they will not be able to compensate. So that's other point. The environment limitation of the feed intake can be there, can be present. So that's something that we need to consider. In this situation, we need to try to understand what's the physical limitation of our birds to eat and keep our energy and amino acid concentration in a way to provide the milligrams that they need at that feed intake and not trying to make they eat more.
Another question, sir. Uh, when the action of the NSP enzyme is substrate dependent, how can we standardize the economics? In our slide, we have shown the advantage of the inclusion levels and how it is affected on that thing. So depending upon the substrate composition only, its impact will be there. The question is how can we standardize the economics of that engine?
And that's the point, right? When we see NSP enzyme matrix, basically what they are providing us is an easier way to use the product, but this easier way is not almost the most technically correct way. When you are using an NSP enzyme, what we should try to do is to understand the percentual increase of digestibility for every single ingredient. So let's say for corn or for maize, usually a NSP that it's with at least xylanase and glucanase and a little bit of manganese and let's say galactosidase, they can increase in about 2%. The 2% depending or up to 4 or 5% depends on the amount of every single uh, enzyme that we have. For energy, it can be from 2 to 3% for maize. If you go to soybean meal, it's going to be slightly different. If you go to sunflower, it's going to be slightly different. So the most technical way to standardize this would be you have all your ingredients, a matrix with the enzyme and without the enzyme. So with the enzyme, let's say maize, 3370 kilocalories. Without, with the enzyme would be 3370 plus 2%. So that would be the the two matrix. The same thing you would be doing for amino acids, and the same thing you would be doing for all ingredients that you are using, with and without the enzyme. So when you are using the enzyme, you use formulate with the ingredients matrix with the enzyme. If you're not using, you remove and you shift to the other one. So in this way, you would be proportionally supplying energy and proportionally supplying amino acids according to every single ingredient inclusion. So this is the way to use and this is the way to standardize. But of course, it's not practical at all because you would need to double all your grains and protein sources nutritional matrix. And you would need to change 10 to 15 ingredients every time you are formulating. So what the suppliers do, it's average. Okay, in an average diet of 62% maize, 22% soybean meal, this would be the release in energy. So they divide this by the inclusion of the enzyme and provide you a fixed matrix. And this is the, as I say, the lazy way to use enzyme, but it's the most practical way, and that's what we see every day. But for sure, it's not the most technical way to use.
Sir, another question, sir. If we use so many non-conventional raw material, replacing the conventional raw materials, how much production loss we can expect to break even of a farm profitability?
Yeah, I guess this is more a commercial answer than a technical answer. I guess depends on how much you're paying on your maize, how much you're paying your soybean meal, how much you're paying on the alternative ingredients, and how well you are formulating. So, Dr. Prasad, you are on the field every single day and you are seeing this. I would like to see your input on this because I would have just general answers. So you help me with that, sir.
As you told now, this is all depend upon the raw material, because here also the profitability and the final cost of the feed by changing the unconventional raw material, it varies from area to area, sir. Some unconventional raw materials are cheaper in the northern India when compared to the southern India. There, the cost of production is less, and the profitability by replacing the conventional thing, it is more, sir. Whereas it is not that much in case of the southern India. And also it depend upon the final egg price also, sir. At that time, how the egg price and other things is, sir. Maybe variable factors are there in concluding the exact profitability or what is the break-even price and other things.
I fully agree.
Yeah. Sir, sir, one question is there, what is the optimum crude fiber percentage? Maybe most probably in the layer diet is mentioned.
We don't have in our guides recommendation of crude fiber content. Um, we never had, basically, because the difference where our primary breeding program are, if you consider the European genetics, the majority of them, Hendrix, and even some from the W group, they will be selected more on what we say, at least as US reference, non-conventional ingredients. That's wheat, barley, oats, stuff like this, where the fiber takes a huge importance on the diet, while our birds are being more selected on maize, soybean meal. And this is a one part of why highlining birds tend to have a lower feed intake than the European birds, because they are both selected in more digestible ingredients, and usually they are feeding, at least here, in a slightly higher energy levels than the European strains. So for us, uh, fiber was not, or was never, a major concern, on, first because of this difference, and secondary because of the behavior of our birds. We almost no see, even though our birds are very active, they are not aggressive. And we know that it's quite crucial to use fiber when you have some strains that are a little bit more prone to aggression. That's not our case. So we are more recommending particle size that would have some similar effects in gut development, especially in the grower phase, than fiber. Would not have the problems of metabolic heat during summer, and we still would have a good results. So we don't have a recommendation. I would say in practical approach, we see levels from 4 to 7% of crude fiber in the growing phase, from 3 to 5% in the production phase as practical levels. But again, we don't have official crude fiber recommendation in our guides.
Sir, another question regarding this environmental day temperature, sir. And what is the energy requirement with the increase or decrease of the temperature? Is there any relation or always required high energy for getting high performance?
So we have to split this in two, right? Energy requirement per bird per day, and energy requirement in terms of kilocalorie per kilo of the diet. So whenever you increase the temperature, you decrease the energy requirement per bird. This decrease is going to be proportional to the body weight and the egg mass. So if we are talking about peak of production, at 96, 97% with a 57 to 58 grams egg, that would be about 54, 53 egg mass in terms of grams per bird per day. In 1.6 kilos, it can be about 1.6 to 1.8 kilocalories for every single half degree that we increase. So you increase from 22 to 22 and a half, you decrease 2 kilocalories on the diet. not on the diet, 2 kilocalories per bird per day. Now, the point is, as the same way you reduce the kilocalories per bird per day, when the temperature increase, you reduce the feed intake. So then you can see what's gonna happen with the one that reduces more. If your feed intake decreases faster than the energy requirement, when the temperature increase, you have to increase the kilocalories per kilo of the diet. But if when your energy requirement increases, but your feed decrease not as the same proportion, we don't need to increase, you need to decrease the energy. So for sure the requirement's gonna decrease, but the kilocalories per kilo depends on how your feed intake gonna react to the temperature. And this will be a consequence of management, this will be a consequence of water availability, of water temperature, of stocking density. All of this gonna affect your feed intake. So that would be a huge variable, but for sure the energy requirement will decrease. Dr. Jivan, Dr. Prasad, I believe you're both on mute.
Yeah. Another question is with regard to lysine source, whether lysine hydrochloride is better or lysine sulfate is better.
Yeah, this is a common question, right? We can have some advantages on the lysine sulfate compared to lysine hydrochloride. Uh, in theory, we can have, but what I like to see that sometimes we are aiming to this very mm, minimal contribution that or difference that they can have before we see the major points that it's controlling the feed intake of our birds, controlling the ideal protein. So I would say, okay, after you do a formula with balanced amino acid ratios, with good ingredients, knowing the solubility of your limestone, uh, knowing the anti-nutritional factors and balancing the intestinal quality, having no excess of nutrients generating problems in the intestine or generating enteritis. After all of this, you could see some difference in performance between using lysine sulfate or lysine hydrochloride. Before that, I guess we have a huge list of variables that generate more impact than the form of the amino acid that we are using. So yes, we can have some difference, but I guess it's a lot of steps before that we need to figure it out. You are on mute, Dr. Jivan.
Yeah. In summer, for particular Indian economy, what is the minimum percent of digestible lysine energy for the optimal production?
Yeah, this is becoming a more and more common question, right? And we don't have an answer for that, mainly because even though this is a very common questions or a very logical question for broilers that are not very efficient in regulating their feed intake according to energy intake, this is not the situation for laying hens. Laying hens are remarkable animals in terms of regulating their feed intake according to the energy concentration of the diet. So if I try to do a ratio of lysine to energy, and if I increase or decrease my energy in order to achieve a certain ratio, what's going to happen is that differently from broilers, these laying hens will start to eat more or less, and they will self-regulate their feed intake according to the energy concentration of the diet. So the answer is we don't have lysine to energy ratio or energy to lysine, whatever you want to use, because basically laying hens regulate their feed intake according to energy. So if we try to set something, they will change according to their requirements. So we don't have one. On mute, sir.
Can we consider the 4% increase in the digestible amino acid when you use when we use the protease enzyme compared to 2%?
Yeah, so the 2% that I said was on an NSP enzyme. Of course, it's not the main or the key functionality of this product. With protease, we can easily achieve 4%. Depends on the kind of the protease and the concentration of the protease, we can easily see 7% increase in amino acid digestibility. So depends on the ingredient, depends on the additive, and depends on the dose of the additive that you are using. But yeah, easily.
How to manage the diet electrolyte balance when we are using alternative sources?
Electrolyte balance,
Yes.
the same way. You have to load uh, sodium, potassium, and chloride values to your dye or to your matrix, and you have to formulate in a way to try to keep your chloride levels as low as possible or as close as possible from your sodium levels, and try to boost potassium levels in a way to try, I would say, to keep higher than 220, 218. If you are able to get a potassium source, you could easily get to 250. So I guess the same way, you just load the three main contributors. If you go to other species, even sodium would be, even magnesium and manganese would be a concern, but not for laying hens. So just sodium, potassium, chloride, and just balance them in this way.
Next question is, what is your opinion on consumption-based feed formulation in
What's
layers?
the?
What is your opinion on the consumption-based feed formulation for layers, feed intake base?
I don't get the question. The
What
feed?
is what is your opinion on the feed consumption-based formulation?
No, I don't get the feed intake based on formulation, or the other way around. Formulate based on feed intake.
Yes, yes.
I think it's crucial and the best way to do it. So, the way we do, it's have a define a requirement according to the egg production or egg mass and body weight of those birds. So let's say at peak of production, we have 820 milligrams of lysine and 310 kilocalories per bird per day. And then we divide this to multiple feed intake from 85 to 110 grams per bird per day, and according to of what the bird is eating and according to their performance, you feed one specific diet. So from commercial farms that I'm assisting, I can have a nutritional grid of about 100 to 120 formulas covering different requirements and different feed intakes, and the farm manager just choose the diet according to exactly this. So he knows that if the bird is at 87% of production with a 60-gram egg weight and eating 103 grams, that should be the diet. He doesn't necessarily know what is in this diet or the profile, but he's the one that chooses the diet that the flock will be eating according to the performance and feed intake. So for me, that's the most technical way to feed a bird. I don't know if that was the question, but yes. Everyone on mute.
One
No more
question.
questions?
There is a question related to broiler breeders.
Yeah, broiler breeder, it's not something that I'm deeply into. So unless you or Dr. Prasad want to answer, I would absent from these ones.
In broiler breeders, we are using restricted feeding. There is no scope for the bird to increase the feed intake while on the low energy feed. Will you will this have impact on long run production?
Yeah, if you want to answer that, Dr. Jivan, as I said, we don't have any broilers. So yeah, there's no point for me to answer. So you guys probably could cover the broiler questions, please.
Prasad sir, can you take that question?
I think Dr. Prasad is having some difficulty in logging in. He just got disconnected.
We'll get back to that question after
Yes.
yes. Sir, right now, sir, we have taken maximum questions from my side. Yeah. Are you seeing any questions there, sir? Maximum question. Maximum question I have covered.
Right. So just a second.
I'm seeing some questions in the chat. Let me see. Yeah, I see one here. After recovery from viral infection, should you increase the protein percentage in the feed? That's a good question. Any disease that our birds are facing, they will have absolutely a increase in amino acids and protein as a consequence. Uh, the same way we're gonna have an increase in energy requirements as well. So I would say not after recovering from the viral infection, but especially during the challenge, you need to consider the nutrient allocation in terms of energy and amino acids to immunological modulation. So I like to have some disease challenge formulas with higher energy, higher amino acid, and especially much higher vitamins to help with the process. After that, yes, that can be helpful to increase production, but since the production will be lower and the body weight's probably going to be lower as well, the nutrient requirements are not as high. So a standard diet could be also very helpful, but during the challenge, I think would be crucial.
Another question is there. What is your recommendation for chicks, either mash feed or crumble feed?
For chicks,
Yes.
I'm a huge fan of crumble, of pelletizer diets for various reasons. First of all, selection. Uh, Day old chicks or up to, let's say, 10, 20 days chicks, they have a very, very limited feed intake capacity. And we know that chickens, they eat according to the particle size. So they tend to eat the coarse particles first and then the powdery portion of the diet. So if we allow these small chicks to have selective eating, they're gonna have a very uneven nutrient intake. They will eat the grains first, so they will have some energy, but they will not eat the dust particles, so they will not have enough vitamins, probably not enough amino acids. With the crumble diet, it's impossible for them to have selective eating. They're gonna eat a particle that's gonna have everything inside. So it's first of all a more uniform nutrient intake. Second, we may have some beneficial effects in the starch availability from the grains. So we may have, even that's a little bit controversial, a better nutrient utilization when you use pellet diets, uh, up to the point where I'm not a huge fan to keep with pelletizer diets for a longer period than 5 weeks, because we can see that this can start to limit the feed intake of those birds. So even though I'm a huge fan of crumble or pelletizer diets at the beginning, I prefer the mesh diets from the grower onwards.
Does the particle size of a feed matters for the production or in body weight gain? Or if yes, what is the optimal size?
It matters a lot. As I said, birds, they eat according to the particle size, so they don't feel taste. What they have is like mechanic receptors around the peak, so they eat to satisfy this need to eat coarse particles. So that's why you see in a mesh diet, they will try to eat first the grains and then the powdery part. uh, the ideal particle size depends on what is your purpose. If you are trying to stimulate feed intake, you want a particle size that it's more than 1100, 1200 microns. If you are trying to control feed intake, you may want to keep around 600, 700 microns. Uh, Remembering that if you go to a very low particle size, you start to have feed clogging to the peak of the birds, clogging the salivary glands, and this can decrease a lot the feed intake capacity of those birds. If you go to a much coarser diet, you can have a lot of problems during distribution because the coarse particle will not be dragged or will not be falling into the beans at the same speed of the powdery. So you need to find out, and also transportation. If you have longer transportation with bad roads, the coarse or the very coarse diets will start to demix, right? The powder part goes down into the truck and the coarse goes up. So you have a demixing of the diet inside the truck. So you need to find a balance. Very fine, it's bad for the birds. Very coarse, it's attractive to the birds, but it's difficult to manage. So I would say 1100 microns is a good balance. Can be more, can be less according to your reality.
I will take another question. In case of low protein diet, either we should increase the amino acid levels or follow the standard amino acid levels.
No, you should keep the amino acid levels. What you should do, of course, it's balance the ideal protein according to the feed intake that you have. So as you could see in my formulation, I actually do the other way around. My protein is a consequence of the amino acid. So I will never decrease protein if I don't have enough amino acids. So my point is we needed to supply the correct amount of amino acids in order to reduce the protein and not the way around. So you just leave the protein as a consequence of the amino acids and don't define a minimal or maximum amount of protein.
There is a question about the cotton seed having a negative factor, and what kind of problems can arise on the bird.
Uh, we can have problems of the egg quality, egg color. We can have problems of this color of the yolk can become a little bit pink. We can have a lot of intestinal problems. So we can have this black and very pasty diarrhea that can be clogged like to the eggshell. And when you try to clean, you make a lot of dirty eggs, so you can have this very black manure attached to the egg, and you can have either some disruption in eggshell quality because of bad mineral absorption.
And there's another question about how to decrease the feed intake during the summer season.
How to decrease or increase?
Sorry, the decrease.
Well, during the summer, the feed intake will be naturally decreasing because first the birds require less energy because the environmental temperature is closer to their body temperature, so they don't need so much kilocalories to generate metabolic heat. So their energy requirement is less, and also they because of the environment itself, they are going to be painting a lot of time, so they would not be eating. So you have a natural decrease on the feed intake. If you need to reduce further the feed intake, I don't know why you would need it, but if you need, always what you can do is increase energy, decrease particle size, and do a different lighting distribution, pushing more lights towards the hot periods of the day and less lights during the cool periods of the day. So this would be limiting the feed intake, but for sure this would be affecting your performance.
Right. Yeah, I think there are similar repetitive questions. Dr. Jeevan, do you see anything else?
Sir, one question is there, sir. For feeding a layer using the feed intake approach, can you guide how to keep updating the equation used?
Can we guide what?
Can you guide how to keep updating the equation?
Okay, let me try to find my Uh, let's see if I can find the file here. Give me a few seconds, please. I'm trying to find. Okay, let's move to other question while I try to find this, but I have a matrix that we could probably would be helpful to answer this. And
Yeah,
as soon
there's
as I find
another.
we got back.
Yeah, the other question is, does low crude protein diet affect on birds' health, like viral problems?
Low crude protein effect on bird health.
Yes.
I think it's positive. The higher crude protein we have, more excess of amino acid we have, more possibility of enteritis do we have, and less nutrient absorption. The lower protein or at the right amino acid levels, for sure we have better intestinal quality, and we know the intestine is the intestine is the primary barrier for every single disease. So we tend to have healthier birds in lower protein levels with the proper amino acid balance.
What about adding oil in layers diet during the summer month?
For me, not only in the summer, I add, if you see my formulas, I have a constant inclusion of at least 1% of oil in all my diets, regardless the energy requirement. Even though if I need to add some fiber or some fulfillment ingredients to reduce my energy, I still keep a minimum amount of oil for many reasons. First, the generation of energy through lipids, it's much easier for the bird than from starch or from carbohydrates. So it generates much less metabolic heat. So in summer, very important, because you provide the same amount of kilocalories generating less than half of the metabolic heat. But in the other way, because of this physiological aspect, it's less complicated to deliver to metabolize oil than starch or carbohydrates. So I like to keep always a minimum amount of oil, regardless the season, regardless the energy level, and also because you split, right, the responsibility. It's always, in my opinion, preferable to have 2 or 3 ingredients supplying the same nutrient than just one. So if one fails, you have another 1 or 2. So if the energy supply from my grains are not optimal, I still have some oil to help me. So I always prefer to have multiple ingredients for the same nutrient.
Right. Yeah, there is a question about does low CP percentage in an adult layer male have effect in fertility?
Lower protein in males versus fertility.
Yeah.
It can, but mainly I would see a lot of management issues first, because uh, lower protein can generate some effects in the how the female reacts to the males. I would say that depending on the amino acid, especially tryptophan, you can have a disruption in B5. And if you have less B5, you have more aggressive birds. So because of lower tryptophan, you can have a female that doesn't accept the male. So it can indirectly affect the fertility rates because of the behavior of the birds. But I would say that in terms of direct impact, trace minerals could have more effect into that. But yes, in terms of indirect effect and behavior, yeah. I found here, let me share my screens here. Where
Sure.
is it? So if you see this, and sorry that it's not in English, but basically this is the way we do for the diets for different feed intake and different production. So what we have here is feed intake in grams per bird per day. So
Vitor,
85.
Vitor, you have not shared the screen. We are not able.
Really?
Yes.
Now?
Just perfect.
Yes.
Fine.
So you
Now,
see this 85 to 125 here, right?
yes, now we can see it. Yes.
Okay. And in this side, what we have is the production. So 95% of production or more, 90 to 95, 85 to 90. So basically in my farm or on the commercials, what happens is if I have a, let's say 83% production to 114 grams of feed intake, the bird would be eating. So between 80 and 85, this would be the line. And if it's 113, this would be between 110 and 15. So this bird would be eating a highline brown diet, 110-80. So this is a diet simulated to 80% of production at a standard egg weight to 110 grams. Now, if I have any problem in this farm and the feed intake decreases, let's say 10 grams, but the production doesn't change, the farm manager know that the next week he has to order a highline brown 180. That would be the same formula in terms of nutrient requirement, but concentrated to 10 grams less of feed intake. If my production decreases, I can have a diet for 75 to the same feed intake. If my production or my feed intake increases and the production remains the same, this would be the diet. But the farm managers are also instructed that the higher the second number here, like 95% or more of production, 90% production, those diets are more concentrated. So if they are struggling, for example, with egg weight, and the birds are, let's say, at 113 grams, he can shift from 180 to 185 because he knows that this formula is for the same feed intake, but going to have more amino acids. So as you can see here, what is the profile of the diet? It doesn't matter for the farm manager, but he knows how to navigate through this table here in order to provide the proper amount of nutrients in different feed intakes or to provide more or less nutrients in the same feed intake. So this becomes very practical for the farms to manage different diets. So at the end of the day, I have no idea which phase those chickens are eating. The farm manager is the one who decides what the bird should eat according to the performance and the feed intake. Okay, so I don't know if that was the question on how to use, but that's the way we do here.
There, sir, can we take a last question? One question.
Yeah, I think from Dr. Vikas, there is a question about after postmortem, if the bird is showing too much of belly fat, what does it mean? Does it is there a mistake in the feed formula? Is what he's asking.
Yeah. So that's a common issue, and even though, as we saw, laying hens are remarkably efficient in regulating the feed according to the feed intake, the feed according to the energy concentration, they can eventually be eating much more calories than they need if the other nutrients are not in the same proportion. So if I have the correct energy on the diet, but I have a much lower amino acid, or even if I have a limestone, for example, if it's not very soluble. So I'm providing 4 grams of calcium, but a calcium that's just, let's say, 10% soluble instead of 35% soluble. So they have much lower calcium in the bloodstream that they should have. So they will try to compensate with a little bit higher consumption of feed. So they will eat a little bit more of energy. The same way we can have some factors in terms of imbalance of vitamins that can affect how the energy is allocated between the egg production and the the energy reserves, or the absorption of energy as fat. So it can be some factors of unbalanced calcium, unbalanced amino acid levels. It can either be a little bit of mycotoxins. It can be some disease challenge that those birds had, and are trying to overcompensate in terms of feed consumption. But for me, one of the main impacts, or one of the most common causes of excessive fat pad, are birds that were overweighted between 12 and 18 weeks. Birds that, especially birds that had a low body weight up to 12 weeks, and they increased their body weight between 12 and 18 weeks. So let's say they were 10% less body weight compared to the table at 12 weeks. And from 12 weeks to 18 weeks, they moved to minus 10 to plus 5%, for example. These birds accumulate a lot of fat, and they will not be efficient birds in regulating the feed intakes. So compensation of feed intake in the third part of the growing phase, it's one of the most common causes to have obese birds and low efficiency in self-regulated feed intake in adult phase.
All right. So we do have few more questions, which I think we will, we'll make a note of that and get back to them, because it is time. So we will make a note of that. Dr. Jeevan, anything, any other question that you think you want to take now?
Most of the question I take, sir. One question is like, sir, how to identify? It means question is like, poor quality feed affect which organ first?
In my opinion, liver and the intestinal tract would be the first ones that would be seeing some effects. After that, you can start to see some spleen problems. You can start to see even some pancreas problem, but for sure, the liver and the upper intestinal tract would be the first ones that you would notice some problem.
We have tried to cover maximum question right now. If something left out, then we can reply by mail.
Okay, sounds good.
Yes. All right. So with that, Vitor, we really thank you so much for an excellent presentation and having so many questions answered. Thank you so much. And we will let everybody, we have made a note of the questions. We will revert back to you.
Okay.
Yes. So
no, it's my pleasure to be here with you guys, and I really hope that in the near future we can do this in person again.
Okay. All right. So with that, we're declaring this webinar complete. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.